Stop scrolling. This girl just threw her entire future away to feed a stinking beggar, while her rich friends laughed at her face. They called her pathetic. They called her a failure. But she had no idea she was actually being hunted by the most powerful woman in the country. This isn't just a good deed, it's a calculated trap. Most of you are too selfish to do what she did. But wait until you see the absolute insanity of who that woman actually was. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by accident. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, please subscribe, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The red dust of the Masakambura Highway rose in a rhythmic, choking dance, swirling behind the heavy-duty bus like a ghost of the earth itself. Eliana sat pressed against the vibrating window, her forehead resting on the cool glass, watching the emerald landscape of Uganda transform from the chaotic sprawl of Kampala's outskirts into the undulating, poetic curves of the Western Cattle Corridor. Beside her, her mother, Mrs. Namono, clutched a leather-bound Bible to her chest, her lips moving in a silent, rhythmic intercession that seemed to pace the engine's roar. This wasn't just a trip. It was a pilgrimage, a mandatory spiritual recalibration that Eliana had initially resisted, her mind heavy with the stagnant career prospects and the shallow, dating pool of the city. Yet, as the air grew thinner and cooler, scented with the sharp, medicinal tang of eucalyptus and the ancient smell of long-horned Ankole cattle, she felt the frantic pulse of her urban life begin to slow. The hills rose like the backs of prehistoric giants, draped in velvet tea plantations and banana groves that defied the steepness of the terrain, whispering of a world that existed long before the concrete and the noise. She watched the sunset bleed across the horizon, a bruised purple and burnt orange that felt almost cinematic, a silent overture to the spiritual weight of what lay ahead in the Valley of Prayer. To Eliana, the West had always been a place of myth, a land of tall people with soft voices and a fierce pride in their heritage. But as the bus hummed deeper into the heart of the highlands, it felt more like a sanctuary of forgotten truths. Her mother's excitement was a palpable thing, a shimmering energy that filled the cramped space between their seats, fueled by the promise of the Global Fire Retreat, where 2,000 believers were currently descending. Eliana wondered if she was even capable of the kind of fervor her mother possessed, or if she was merely a passenger in someone else's spiritual journey, a leaf caught in the wake of a powerful current. She thought of her friends back in the city, likely sitting in dimly lit cafes complaining about the same old dramas, and for a moment she felt a flicker of superiority, followed immediately by a wave of guilt. She was 24, standing at the precipice of a life she hadn't quite designed for herself, heading toward a camp where the only curriculum was surrender. As the stars began to pierce the darkening canopy of the sky, appearing larger and more brilliant than they ever did through the smog of the capital, Eliana closed her eyes and let the swaying of the bus lull her into a state of expectant suspension, unaware that the coordinates of her destiny were already being recalibrated by the very dust she was traveling over. The arrival at the campsite was a sensory explosion that defied the serenity of the surrounding hills, a sprawling metropolis of white canvas and nylon pitched against the deep, earthy brown of the cleared forest floor. Torches and solar lanterns flickered like grounded stars across the valley, illuminating the movement of hundreds of people, a sea of diverse faces, from the sharp features of Ethiopian pilgrims to the vibrant patterns of West African robes, all converging under the banner of a singular, desperate hope. The air was thick with the low hum of collective murmuring, a vibration that Eliana felt in the soles of her feet before she heard it with her ears, as if the ground itself were breathing in prayer. Her mother navigated the organized chaos with the practiced ease of a veteran traveler, her eyes scanning for their designated sector among the 2,000 residents of this temporary city. Eliana hauled their bags, the weight of their belongings a grounding contrast to the ethereal atmosphere, marveling at how a remote corner of Uganda could suddenly become the center of the world for so many. The logistics were staggering. Communal kitchens venting the savory steam of massive pots of matukan beans, the rhythmic clanging of a bell signaling the evening's final gathering, and the sight of children playing in the shadows of giants, their laughter weaving through the solemnity of the prayers. Settling into their modest tent, Eliana felt the sheer scale of the human experience pressing on her, a realization that her personal anxieties were but a single drop in an ocean of 2,000 different stories. The interior of the tent smelled of dry grass and new fabric, a humble space that stripped away the pretenses of social status and left only the raw essence of the person within. As she helped her mother spread out their thin sleeping mats, Eliana listened to the symphony of the camp, a woman singing a soft lullaby in a language she didn't recognize, the distant, thunderous amen of a late-night prayer circle, and the constant, rhythmic chirping of crickets that seemed to be trying to outsing the humans. There was a strange, haunting beauty in the anonymity of the crowd, a sense that for the next 10 days, she was no longer a junior marketing analyst or a daughter with unmet expectations, but simply a soul among souls. She lay down that first night, the cold mountain air nipping at her nose while the rest of her body was buried under thick wool blankets, watching the silhouettes of people passing by the tent walls. It was a cinematic tableau of devotion, a landscape of shadows and light that felt like a dream, yet the hardness of the ground beneath her was a firm reminder that this journey would be as much about her physical presence in the world as it was about her spiritual ascent. The dawn in Western Uganda does not break with a sudden burst of light. Rather, it uncurls slowly, a pale blue ghost rising from the valley floor to meet the descending silver of the mountain mist. Eliana awoke to the sound of a distant trumpet, a shofar, echoing against the limestone cliffs, its mournful, ancient cry piercing through the thin nylon of her tent. The air inside was freezing, a sharp contrast to the warmth of her heavy blankets, and as she exhaled, her breath formed a delicate cloud that hovered before her eyes like a fleeting thought. She sat up, her joints stiff from the thin mattress, and watched the silhouette of her mother already kneeling in the corner, a dark shadow of devotion against the pre-dawn light. There was something unnerving about the silence of 2,000 people waking up in unison, a collective rustle of fabric and hushed whispers that felt more powerful than any roar. As Eliana pulled on her thickest woolen sweater and stepped outside, the grass beneath her boots was slick with a frost that looked like fallen stars, and the hills were draped in a fog, so dense it felt as though the world had ended just beyond the perimeter of the camp. She felt a profound sense of isolation in that moment, a realization that despite being surrounded by thousands of seekers, she was still carrying the heavy, silent weight of her own uncertainty, a quiet desperation that no amount of communal singing had yet managed to touch. The internal landscape of Eliana's mind was, at that moment, as cluttered and misty as the valley surrounding her. As she walked toward the communal washing area, dodging the early risers who moved with a purposeful, spiritual gait, she couldn't help but reflect on the trajectory of her life in Kampala. She saw herself as a woman caught between two worlds. The modern, high-speed expectations of her corporate job, where value was measured in metrics and deliverables, and this ancestral, spiritual realm where value was found in surrender and stillness. The pressure to marry, to succeed, and to embody the perfect Ugandan daughter felt like a tightening corset, leaving her breathless and perpetually exhausted. She wondered if her mother's insistence on this retreat was a genuine concern for her soul, or a strategic move to place her in the path of godly men from influential families. The thought left a bitter taste in her mouth, one that even the crisp, mountain air couldn't wash away. She watched the sun finally crest the peaks, turning the mist into a shimmering veil of gold, and for a fleeting second, she felt a spark of something, not quite hope, but a curiosity. If there was a plan for her life, as the preachers claimed, it was currently hidden behind a veil as thick as the morning fog, and she found herself bracing for whatever truth the light might eventually reveal as the day burned the shadows away. By mid-morning, the great assembly tent, A massive structure that looked like a white cathedral made of air and tension was vibrating with the sound of 2,000 voices lifted in a harmony that felt physical. The worship was not merely a performance. It was a tidal wave of sound, a mixture of English hymns, Luganda chants, and the rhythmic, guttural praises of the local Runyon speakers. Eliana stood in the middle of the throng, her eyes closed, trying to let the music wash over her, but her mind remained a stubborn fortress of observation. She noticed the way the light filtered through the canvas, creating long, dusty beams that illuminated the sweat on the brows of the worshippers and the tears streaming down the faces of strangers from across the globe. There were businessmen in expensive suits kneeling next to village elders in tattered coats, their social hierarchies dissolved by the sheer intensity of the atmosphere. The drums provided a heartbeat for the valley, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to synchronize the pulses of everyone present, creating a singular, living organism of faith. Yet, Eliana felt like a glitch in the system, a spectator standing on the shore of an ocean everyone else was drowning in, her heart remaining frustratingly tethered to the shore of logic and self-consciousness. The preacher's voice, amplified by a sound system that sent echoes bouncing off the distant hills, spoke of divine appointments and the unseen eyes of the Creator. He paced the stage with a restless energy, his words weaving a narrative of destiny that felt both exhilarating and terrifying to Eliana. He spoke of how the greatest tests of character often happened outside the temple walls, in the mundane moments when one thinks no one is watching. These words snagged on the edges of Eliana's consciousness, lingering there like a burr on wool. She looked around at the faces of her peers, young women her age who seemed lost in a trance of devotion, and wondered if they truly believed that their lives were being orchestrated by a higher power, or if they were simply comforted by the idea. The heat inside the tent began to rise as the sun reached its zenith, the air growing thick with the scent of frankincense and humanity. Eliana felt a sudden, claustrophobic urge to escape the intensity, to find a space where the air wasn't charged with such heavy expectations. As the session transitioned into a period of deep, silent meditation, she found her gaze wandering toward the open flaps of the tent, looking past the crowded benches toward the emerald hills that promised a different kind of sanctuary, one that didn't require an audience or a microphone. The afternoon sun brought a deceptive warmth to the highlands, a golden clarity that tempted the pilgrims out of the shadowed tents and into the open air. During the long lunch break, Eliana found herself gravitating toward a group of young people she had met at the communal dining hall. Sarah, a spirited law student from Entebbe, and Tindo, a soft-spoken architect who seemed as observant as Eliana herself. They sat on the grass, picking at plates of steaming matuk and groundnut sauce, the conversation a welcome relief from the spiritual intensity of the morning. They laughed about the cold nights and the snoring in the communal sectors, their voices forming a small bubble of normalcy in the middle of the massive retreat. Sarah suggested they take a walk beyond the camp's perimeter, arguing that they hadn't come all the way to the west just to see the inside of a tent. There was a sense of rebellion in the idea, a small break from the structured schedule of the retreat that appealed to Eliana's restless spirit. She looked at her mother, who was deep in conversation with a group of older women, and realized she had a window of freedom, a chance to see the community that existed in the shadow of this international event. As they gathered their things to leave, Eliana felt a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. The camp felt like a protected island, a curated experience of faith and fellowship, but the world outside the gates was the reality that these people would eventually return to. She adjusted her scarf against the rising wind, her mind already shifting away from the sermons and toward the physical beauty of the landscape. They joked about finding a local shop that sold real soda, tired of the lukewarm tea served in the camp. Tindo spoke about the architecture of the local homesteads, the way they were built to withstand the mountain winds, and Eliana found herself listening with a renewed interest in the world around her. She felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since arriving, a sense that the divine appointment the preacher mentioned might not be found in a crowded tent after all, but in the simple act of walking with new friends under an open sky. They set off toward the dusty road that wound its way down toward the village. Three young souls looking for a momentary escape, unaware that they were walking directly into the center of a story that had been written long before they reached the gates of the camp. Walking out of the retreat's main gate felt like crossing an invisible border into another century. The hum of the sound system faded, replaced by the organic soundtrack of rural life. The distant lowing of cattle, the rhythmic thud of a wooden pestle hitting a mortar, and the high-pitched chirps of children playing in the banana groves. The road was a ribbon of packed red earth, flanked by tall eucalyptus trees that shivered in the breeze, their silver leaves whispering secrets of the soil. As Eliana, Sarah, and Tendo walked, they passed local villagers who looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and practiced indifference. They were used to the influx of city people who came once a year to pray and then vanished. Eliana noticed the details of the houses they passed: mud brick walls plastered with smooth clay, thatched roofs that smelled of dry grass, and small gardens of kale and beans that were meticulously tended. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling, temporary city of the retreat, representing a permanence and a struggle that felt more grounded than the lofty rhetoric of the preachers. The air here was thinner, sharper, and carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, making Eliana feel more awake than she had in days. They reached a small trading center, a collection of 4 or 5 brick shops with faded Coca-Cola signs and wooden benches out front. A group of local men sat under the shade of a massive fig tree, their conversation halting as the 3 strangers approached. Sarah and Tendo were busy debating the merits of local versus city education, their voices energetic and full of the confidence of youth. Eliana, however, found her attention drawn to the periphery. She saw the way the shadows moved across the hills, the way the light caught the dust kicked up by a passing goat, and she felt a deep, unexplainable connection to the land. It wasn't just beauty, it was a sense of endurance. She realized that the people living here didn't have the luxury of a 10-day retreat from their problems. Their faith was lived out in the daily survival against the elements and the economy. As her friends moved toward a shop to buy their sodas, Eliana lingered by the roadside, her eyes sweeping the horizon. She felt as though she were waiting for something, an anticipation that hummed in her blood, making the mundane sights of the village feel laden with a significance she couldn't yet articulate. The world felt vast and mysterious, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the silence. It was on the return journey, as the sun began its long, golden descent toward the peaks, that Eliana first saw her. The woman was sitting on a low stone beneath the spreading branches of a crooked eucalyptus tree, about 50 yards from the camp's entrance. From a distance, she looked like a bundle of discarded rags, a figure so still and weathered she almost blended into the trunk of the tree. She wore a faded basuti that had long ago lost its vibrant color, and a tattered woolen shawl was wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders despite the afternoon heat. Her feet, bare and cracked like the earth during a drought, were tucked beneath her, and a small, empty plastic bowl sat in the dust by her side. As Sarah and Tendo walked past, deep in a light-hearted argument about the evening speaker, they barely spared her a glance, their eyes fixed on the camp gates and the promise of dinner. To them, she was just another part of the landscape, a common sight in a country where poverty often sat quietly by the road, waiting for a mercy that rarely came in abundance. But Eliana stopped. There is something in the woman's posture, a strange, regal stillness that didn't match the desperation of her clothes. Her head was bowed, her chin resting on her chest, as if she were deep in prayer, or perhaps just exhausted by the weight of her years. The way the light caught the deep lines on her face made her look like a living map of the region's history, her skin the color of dark mahogany polished by time. Eliana felt a sudden, sharp pang of conviction, an echo of the morning's sermon about the eyes of the Creator. She looked at her friends, who were already 20 paces ahead, and then back at the woman. The contrast was jarring. The vibrant, healthy youth of the retreat versus this solitary, aging figure in the dust. Eliana reached into her bag, her fingers finding the heavy lunch pack she hadn't finished, a generous portion of beef stew and rice she had saved for later. It wasn't a grand gesture, but the impulse was visceral, a rejection of the indifference she had seen in her friends and felt in herself. She stepped off the road and moved toward the tree, her heart beating with a nervous rhythm as she approached the woman who hadn't even looked up at the sound of her footsteps. "Excuse me, Mama." Eliana's voice was soft, barely a whisper against the rustle of the eucalyptus leaves. She felt a sudden wave of self-consciousness, wondering if she was being patronizing or if the woman even wanted her help. The old woman moved then, her head lifting with a slow, deliberate grace that caught Eliana off guard. Her eyes were not the clouded, defeated eyes of a beggar. They were sharp, clear, and incredibly deep, a startling amber color that seemed to look right through Eliana's city-bred exterior. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The woman didn't reach for the bowl or start a rehearsed plea for money. She simply watched Eliana with a look of profound, quiet observation. It was as if she were weighing Eliana's soul, measuring the intent behind the action before accepting it. Eliana felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, realizing that her act of charity felt suddenly very small and perhaps even a bit shallow in the face of this woman's intense presence. She knelt down in the red dust, ignoring the way it stained her expensive leggings, and held out the lunch pack with both hands, a gesture of respect she had learned from her grandmother but rarely used in Kampala. "I have some food here, and it's still warm," Eliana said, her running coal a bit rusty but sincere. "I thought you might be hungry, sitting out here so long." The woman's lips, thin and parched, curved into the ghost of a smile, a look that was more knowing than grateful. She reached out and took the container, her fingers surprisingly strong and steady as they brushed against Eliana's. The contact felt like an electric hum, a brief connection between two worlds that should never have met. Behind her, Eliana heard Sarah calling her name, her voice tinged with impatience and confusion. "Indiana, what are you doing? We're going to be late for the evening session." Eliana didn't turn around. She felt a stubborn need to stay, to bridge the gap that her friends were so eager to maintain. She looked at the woman and saw a flick of something in her eyes, an approval, perhaps, or a curiosity. "I'll catch up with you guys," Eliana shouted back over her shoulder, her voice firm. She turned back to the woman and sat down completely on the ground, crossing her legs. "If you don't mind, Mama, I'd like to sit with you for a bit. The camp is too noisy right now." The old woman began to eat, her movements slow and dignified, using her fingers to gather the rice with a precision that spoke of a life of order, not chaos. She didn't gobble the food like someone who hadn't eaten in days. She savored it, occasionally closing her eyes as the spices hit her tongue. Eliana watched her, feeling the tension of the retreat, the schedules, the expectations, the performative faith begin to melt away. Sitting in the dust felt more holy than anything she had experienced inside the white tent. She reached into her bag again and pulled out a bottle of water, opening it and handing it to the woman. "Thank you, daughter of the city," the woman said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like dry leaves skittering over stone. She spoke the local dialect with an accent that was old and melodic, the kind Eliana's mother would call the deep language. She didn't ask for money, nor did she tell a tragic story of how she ended up by the road. Instead, she asked Eliana about the camp. Are they finding what they are looking for in there? The 2,000 who have come to shout at the sky. Eliana laughed, a genuine, startled sound that broke the stillness. I think some are. Others are just looking for a reason to shout. I'm not sure which one I am yet. The woman nodded slowly, taking a sip of the water. She looked toward the camp gates, where the lights were beginning to flicker on as the evening settled in. The sky hears the whispers as clearly as the shouts, she said softly. People come from very far to find what is already inside them, if only they would sit still long enough to hear it. Eliana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This woman wasn't a beggar, She was a philosopher in rags. As they sat there, the sun dipping below the horizon and painting the sky in shades of bruised plum and gold, Eliana felt a strange sense of intimacy with this stranger. She shared her own frustration about her job, her mother's pressure, and the feeling of being a passenger in her own life. The woman listened with an intensity that made Eliana feel truly seen, her occasional nods providing more comfort than any of the sermons she had heard that week. As the twilight deepened, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from the distant peaks. The woman looked up at the clouds, her eyes tracking the movement of the storm with the ease of someone who had lived by the rhythms of the earth for 80 years. "A storm is coming," she remarked, her voice almost lost in the rustle of the eucalyptus. "But the hills know how to hold the rain. It is the flatlands that drown." She turned her gaze back to Eliana, her expression softening into something akin to maternal affection. "You have a good heart, Eliana. Not because you gave me food. Many give food to ease their own guilt, but because you gave me your time. Time is the only thing a person truly owns, and yet it is the thing they are most stingy with." Eliana felt a lump form in her throat, moved by the simple wisdom of the woman's words. She realized that in her rush to find destiny and purpose, she had forgotten the basic human currency of presence. She had spent her life trying to get somewhere else, never realizing that this somewhere she was looking for was always right beneath her feet. The woman reached out and took Eliana's hand, her skin feeling like fine, sun-dried parchment. "Do not be afraid of the road you are on, even if it feels dusty and long," she whispered. "The most beautiful flowers in these hills grow in the places where the soil is poorest, because they have to reach deeper for the water." She then did something unexpected. She took a small, beaded leather cord from her wrist and pressed it into Eliana's palm. It was simple work, the kind sold in local markets, but the beads were worn smooth by years of contact with skin. "A reminder," she said, "that the person you are when no one is watching is the person you truly are. Keep your heart soft, even when the world tries to make it stone." Eliana tried to refuse the gift, feeling that she should be the one giving, but the woman's grip was firm. Before Eliana could ask her name or where she lived, a loud honk from a passing supply truck startled them both, and the woman pulled her shawl tighter around her. She looked toward the camp one last time, a strange, knowing glint in her amber eyes. "Go now, daughter. Your mother will be looking for you. The prayers are starting, and you wouldn't want to miss the shouting." Eliana stood up slowly, her legs tingling as the blood rushed back into them. She felt as though she were waking up from a dream, the colors of the world appearing more vivid, the air tasting sweeter. She looked down at the old woman, who had returned to her posture of quiet stillness, her head once again resting on her chest. "Will you be here tomorrow, Mama?" Eliana asked, her heart heavy with the thought of leaving her there in the cold. The woman didn't look up, but she raised a hand in a small, graceful wave. "The road is always here, Eliana, and so are the trees. Go." Eliana hesitated, then turned and began to walk back toward the camp gates. Every few steps, she looked back, seeing the solitary figure under the crooked tree becoming smaller and smaller until she was just a dark speck against the twilight. The beaded cord in her hand felt warm, a physical anchor to the encounter that had just shifted something fundamental inside her. She felt a strange peace, a sense that the fire the retreat promised had finally been lit, but not by a preacher's words. It had been ignited by a shared meal and the wisdom of a woman the world had forgotten. When she finally re-entered the camp, the noise and the lights felt jarring, like a television turned up too loud. She found her mother standing near their tent, her face etched with worry that quickly turned to relief. "Eliana, where have you been? Sarah said you stayed behind to talk to a beggar." Her mother's voice carried a hint of disapproval, the typical concern of a parent who feared for her daughter's safety and social standing. Eliana just smiled, a small, private smile that didn't reach for an explanation. "I was just learning something, Mama," she said softly, slipping the beaded cord into her pocket. "Something they don't teach in the main tent." Her mother looked at her curiously, sensing a change in her daughter's energy. a stillness that hadn't been there before. As they walked toward the evening session, the sound of 2,000 voices beginning to rise in song, Eliana felt a sense of belonging she hadn't felt all week. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a participant in a story that was much larger than herself, a narrative woven with threads of red dust, mountain mist, and the quiet, observant eyes of a woman who sat by the road, watching the world go by. The final morning of the retreat arrived with a bittersweet clarity that seemed to sharpen the very edges of the horizon. The massive white tent, which had served as a tabernacle for 2,000 souls, now stood like a tired giant, its canvas flapping rhythmically in the rising mountain breeze. Eliana walked through the labyrinth of tents, observing the quiet frenzy of pilgrims packing their lives back into suitcases and woven bags. There was a peculiar silence in the air, not the silence of emptiness, but the heavy, pregnant silence of people carrying something new within them. She found herself moving toward the perimeter fence, her fingers instinctively tracing the smooth surface of the beaded cord in her pocket. The memory of the woman under the eucalyptus tree felt more real than the week of sermons she had endured. She looked out toward the road, hoping to see that solitary figure once more, to offer a final thank you, or perhaps just to confirm that the encounter hadn't been a fever dream born of mountain air and spiritual exhaustion. But the stone beneath the crooked tree was empty, the shadows of the leaves dancing over the cold, red earth where they had sat together. The absence felt like a physical weight, a reminder that some of the most profound moments in life are fleeting, designed to change you and then vanish into the mist of the past. She stood there for a long time, watching the first of the hired buses rumble past the gate, kicking up the same dust that had coated her leggings just days before. Her mother called out to her, her voice thin and distant against the scale of the valley, urging her to help with the final trunk. Eliana realized then that she was mourning a stranger, or perhaps she was mourning the version of herself that didn't believe in divine appointments. The world felt inexplicably larger now, layered with secrets and hidden tests that she had previously been too blind to see. She wondered where the woman had gone. Did she have a home in the village, or was she a wanderer, a holy fool testing the hearts of those who came to find God in a tent? As she turned back to the campsite, she felt a strange shift in her own internal compass. The pressure to return to Kampala and resume her climb up the corporate ladder felt less like an obligation and more like a role she was choosing to play. She was taking back a piece of the West with her, a stillness that the city's chaos could not easily touch. The hills were already beginning to reclaim the valley as the people trickled out, and Eliana knew that while she was leaving the mountain and the woman who lived in its shadows was now firmly rooted in her. The departure was a logistical ballet of chaos and grace. 2,000 people, representing dozens of nations and countless languages, converged on the narrow exit of the camp, their vehicles forming a shimmering line of metal that snaked down the mountainside. The air was filled with the smell of diesel, wood smoke, and the lingering scent of rain-dampened earth. Eliana sat in the back of the SUV her mother had arranged, watching the campsite shrink into a white speck against the vast green tapestry of the highlands. Her mother was in high spirits, recounting the breakthroughs she had witnessed and the powerful connection she had made with other matriarchs of the faith. To Mrs. Namono, the retreat had been a resounding success, a spiritual transaction that had yielded the desired results. But Eliana remained quiet, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. She watched the local children waving from the banana groves, their faces bright and curious, and she wondered how many of them would grow up to sit by the road, watching the world go by. She felt a profound sense of responsibility now, not to a religion, but to the humanity she had touched in the dust. The beaded cord felt warm in her palm, a secret talisman that reminded her of the amber-eyed woman's warning. The person you are when no one is watching is the person you truly are. As the car descended further into the plains, the cool mountain air was replaced by the humid, heavy atmosphere of the lowlands. The transition was jarring, a physical manifestation of the return to reality. Her mother began talking about the upcoming social season in Kampala, mentioning names of families and potential suitors with a renewed vigor that made Eliana's heart sink. The divine appointment her mother was looking for was one of prestige and strategic alliance, a union that would solidify their standing in the city's upper echelons. Eliana listened to the familiar script, but the words felt like they belonged to a foreign language. She thought of the woman's bare, cracked feet and the way she had savored the rice and beef stew as if it were a royal banquet. The disparity between her mother's ambitions and the woman's presence was a chasm she didn't know how to bridge. By the time they reached the outskirts of Mbarara for a quick lunch, Eliana felt as though she were living in two parallel universes. One was the world of noise, ambition, and shouting at the sky, and the other was the world of whispers, dust, and the quiet observation of the soul. She took a deep breath of the thick, lowland air and resolved to hold on to the whisper, even as the noise of the world began to rise once more. Kampala greeted them with its characteristic roar, a cacophony of boda-bodas, construction sites, and the relentless pulse of a city that never stops to pray. Eliana's apartment, once a sanctuary of modern minimalism, now felt cold and strangely hollow. She stood on her balcony overlooking the twinkling lights of the Seven Hills, watching the traffic jam on Entebbe Road, and felt like a stranger in her own life. The office was no better. The marketing meetings and the frantic pursuit of engagement metrics seemed trivial compared to the depth of the conversations she had shared with Tendo and Sarah, and especially the silence she had shared with the woman by the road. Her colleagues noticed the change, a new stillness in her eyes, a lack of interest in the usual office gossip. They attributed it to a post-retreat glow, assuming she had simply found a new level of religious fervor. They couldn't know that she had actually found something much more dangerous to the status quo, a sense of perspective. She began to spend her weekends differently, avoiding the loud, crowded brunches of the elite, and instead seeking out the quiet corners of the city where the real people lived and breathed. Her mother's pressure, however, was a constant tide that refused to recede. Every Sunday lunch was an interrogation disguised as a meal. Mrs. Namono was increasingly frustrated by Eliana's lack of enthusiasm for the eligible men she was being introduced to. You went to the mountain to find a husband, Eliana, not to become a hermit, her mother would exclaim, waving a hand at the beautiful outfit she had bought for her daughter. Eliana would just smile and nod, her mind drifting back to the eucalyptus tree and the beaded cord she kept hidden in her nightstand. She felt as though she were waiting for something, though she couldn't say what. She wasn't looking for a man. She was looking for a sign that the transformation she had felt in the West wasn't just a temporary illusion. The psychological structure of her life had shifted. She was no longer motivated by the fear of being behind her peers. She was operating on a different timeline, one that valued the curiosity gaps of the human experience over the deliverables of social expectation. She was a woman in suspension, a narrative loop waiting to be closed, unaware that the next chapter of her story was already being written in a boardroom hundreds of miles away. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day when the Kampala heat was particularly oppressive. Mrs. Namono's voice on the other end was trembling with a mixture of awe and frantic excitement. Eliana, you won't believe it. The Kiribati have invited us for dinner at their estate this Saturday. Eliana froze at the mention of the name. The Karabo family was legendary in Uganda, old money from the West, with vast holdings in cattle, tea, and telecommunications, but known more for their extreme privacy and their philanthropic reach. They were the kind of family that didn't attend social functions. They were the functions. Why us, Mama? Eliana asked, her marketing brain immediately looking for the catch. The matriarch, Mrs. Karabo, specifically asked for us. She said she heard of our family's character at the retreat. The word character sent a shiver down Eliana's spine. It was a word that had been used frequently during her time in the hills, but hearing it now, in the context of the Kiribati, felt ominous. Her mother was already planning the wardrobe, the hair, the talking points, convinced that this was the big one, the moment they had been praying for. Eliana felt a deep instinctive reluctance to go. She didn't want to be a piece on her mother's chessboard, and she certainly didn't want to be inspected by a family as powerful as the Kiribati. Yet, there was a nagging curiosity, a narrative hook that she couldn't ignore. How did they know her? Why the sudden invitation? She thought of Caleb, the eldest Karabo's son, whose face had occasionally appeared in the business journals, a man described as brilliant, reclusive, and notoriously difficult to please. The city rumors said he had turned down dozens of matches arranged by his family. As Saturday approached, Eliana found herself returning to the beaded cord, holding it until her palm grew warm. She decided that if she was going to go, she would go as herself, not the polished version her mother was trying to construct. She chose a simple, elegant dress in the deep green of the Western Hills, a color that reminded her of the tea plantations. She wore no expensive jewelry, only the invisible armor of the lessons she had learned in the dust. As they drove toward the Karabo estate, a fortress of greenery and stone on the edge of the city, she felt a strange sense of calm. She wasn't going there to win a husband. She was going to see what the universe had in store for the girl who sat in the red dirt. The Karabo estate was not a house. It was a testament to the endurance of the land. Built from local stone and expansive glass, it sat atop a hill that offered a panoramic view of the lake, surrounded by gardens that felt more like a wild, curated forest than a city yard. As Eliana and her mother were ushered in by a butler whose movements were as silent as a shadow, the air inside smelled of beeswax, old books, and fresh lilies. The interior was a masterclass in quiet luxury. No gold leaf or flashy chandeliers, but instead, walls adorned with museum-quality African art and furniture that looked as though it had been carved from the very heart of the mountains. In the center of the drawing room stood Caleb Karabo. He was taller than he appeared in photos, with a presence that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. His eyes were dark and incredibly observant, lacking the arrogant shimmer Eliana had expected. He greeted Mrs. Namono with a respectful bow, but when his gaze landed on Eliana, he paused. It wasn't the look of a man seeing a beautiful woman. It was the look of a man recognizing a riddle he had been trying to solve. The conversation during the initial drinks was surprisingly grounded. Caleb didn't talk about his business or his wealth. He talked about the ecology of the West, the challenges of sustainable farming, and the philosophy of the retreat they had both recently attended. "I was there for the last 3 days," he mentioned casually, his voice a rich baritone that reminded Eliana of the drums in the valley. "But I spent most of my time in the village, away from the crowds. My mother insists that the best way to understand a movement is to look at its edges." Eliana felt a jolt of recognition. The edges. That was exactly where she had been. Her mother was busy trying to impress him with stories of their family's lineage, but Caleb's attention remained fixed on Eliana. He asked her about her work, but more importantly, he asked her what she had learned in the West that she couldn't find in a book. Eliana found herself speaking with an honesty she usually reserved for her journal. She spoke of the silence, the endurance of the hills, and the way the shouting at the sky often drowned out the whispers of the earth. She saw Caleb's expression soften, a flicker of genuine interest replacing his professional mask. He seemed to be looking for something in her words, a confirmation of a truth he already suspected. As they moved toward the dining room, Eliana's eyes were drawn to a large, framed photograph on the hallway wall. It was a black and white portrait, lit with a cinematic intensity that made the subject feel three-dimensional. It was a woman sitting under a tree, her face a map of wisdom and time, her eyes, even in the absence of color, holding that unmistakable amber depth. Eliana stopped in her tracks, her breath hitching in her throat. It was her, the beggar, the woman from the road. But in the photograph, she wasn't wearing rags. She was draped in a magnificent, traditional basuti of silk, her posture regal and commanding. The crooked eucalyptus tree was behind her, its leaves rendered in sharp, silvery detail. Eliana felt the world tilt on its axis. The psychological tension of the last few weeks snapped into a single, blinding moment of realization. The woman wasn't a beggar. She was the matriarch of the Karabo family. She had been sitting in the dust of her own land, watching the 2,000 pilgrims who had come to pray on her doorstep, waiting to see if any of them actually practiced the kindness they claimed to seek. Caleb noticed her frozen stance and stepped up beside her. He looked at the portrait and then back at Eliana, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That is my mother," he said softly, his voice devoid of pretense. "She has a habit of testing the world. She believes that wealth is a veil that hides the true face of the soul, so she often removes it to see who is truly looking." Eliana felt a wave of heat wash over her, followed by a cold shiver of awe. She remembered the beef stew, the way she had sat in the red dirt, the way she had shared her frustrations about her life in the city. She had treated the most powerful woman in the region like a commoner, and in doing so, she had unwittingly passed a test she didn't even know she was taking. Her mother, catching up to them, gasped as she saw the portrait. But that woman. She looks like Mrs. Namono trailed off, the pieces falling into place with a terrifying speed. The silence in the hallway was heavy with the weight of the reveal, a cinematic moment where the beggar and the matriarch merged into a single, formidable entity. "My mother came home from a retreat with a story," Caleb continued, leading them into a dining room where the table was set for 4, though only 3 of them were present. "She spoke of 2,000 people who came to find God, but she only found one person who found a human being." He looked directly at Eliana, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that felt like a proposal in itself. She described a young woman from the city who wasn't afraid to get dust on her clothes, who didn't give out of pity, but out of companionship. She told me that if I ever wanted to find a partner who understood the true meaning of legacy, I should look for the girl with the green scarf and the restless heart. Eliana felt a lump in her throat, her mind racing back to the beaded cord in her pocket. She realized now why Caleb had been so observant, why he'd been looking for a riddle. He wasn't looking for a social match. He was looking for the person his mother had seen in the shadows of a eucalyptus tree. The psychological structure of the entire evening shifted from a formal introduction to a profound acknowledgement of character. Dinner was a surreal experience. Eliana's mother was uncharacteristically quiet, humbled by the sheer scale of the divine appointment that had unfolded. Caleb, however, was vibrant and engaged. He spoke about his mother's philosophy, that the Karabo wealth was merely a tool, and that the family's true strength lay in their ability to remain connected to the soil and the people. He admitted that he had been skeptical of his mother's scouting mission, but seeing Eliana standing in the hallway, recognizing the woman in the rags, had convinced him. "She gave you something, didn't she?" Caleb asked, his eyes dropping to Eliana's pocket. Slowly, Eliana reached in and pulled out the beaded leather cord, laying it on the linen tablecloth. The simple, worn beads looked out of place amidst the fine china and silver, but they held more power than anything else in the room. Caleb reached out and touched the beads, his fingers brushing Eliana's just as his mother's had. "She only gives these to people she trusts," he whispered. "It's a thread of destiny," she says, "a way to find our way back to the things that matter." The double doors at the end of the dining room swung open, and the room seemed to brighten with an internal light. Walking in with a slow, measured gait was the woman from the portrait, but she was even more striking in person. She was dressed in a flowered silk busuti of deep indigo, her silver hair braided into an intricate crown. She didn't look like a beggar anymore, but the eyes, those sharp, amber eyes, were exactly the same. She scanned the room, her gaze lingering on Mrs. Namono with a polite nod, before settling on Eliana. A wide, radiant smile broke across her face, a look of pure, unadulterated joy. "So, the daughter of the city decided to come for dinner after all," she said, her voice no longer a dry rasp but a clear, melodic chime. She walked straight to Eliana, ignoring the formal protocols of the house, and took both of her hands in hers. The warmth was the same, the strength was the same, and the sense of profound observation was even more intense. "You look better in green than you do in red dust," the matriarch joked, her eyes twinkling with mischief. but I think I prefer you in the dust." She sat down at the head of the table, her presence commanding the space without effort. "I watched many people that week, Eliana. I watched them pray, I watched them cry, and I watched them ignore the world around them in their search for the divine. But you sat down. You broke the barrier of the city person, and you remembered that we are all just travelers on the same road." She looked at her son and then back at Eliana. "My son is a good man, but he needs someone who can see through the veil. He needs someone who knows that the most important conversations happen when no one is watching." The dinner that followed was unlike any Eliana had ever experienced. It was filled with laughter, deep philosophical debates, and a sense of belonging that surpassed anything she had felt in the city. The beggar was gone, replaced by a queen, but the spirit of the woman under the eucalyptus tree remained, the same soul that had shared a meal of rice and beef stew in the twilight of the West. The night ended under the stars on the vast stone terrace of the estate. The lake shimmered below them like a sheet of hammered silver, and the lights of Kampala felt small and distant. Caleb and Eliana stood at the railing, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full of the curiosity gaps of a beginning. "My mother doesn't do anything by accident," Caleb said, his voice low and intimate. "She didn't just find a girl by the road. She found a future. But only if that girl wants it." He didn't press for an answer, nor did he make a grand, cinematic declaration. He simply stood there, a man of the land and the city, offering a partnership built on the evidence of a kind heart. Eliana looked at the beaded cord she was now wearing on her wrist, a permanent reminder of the dust and the mist. She realized that her mother had been right about one thing. She had found what she was looking for on the mountain. But it wasn't a strategic alliance or a social contract. It was herself, reflected in the eyes of an old woman who knew how to wait. As she drove home that night with her mother, who was finally, blissfully silent in her awe, Eliana felt the narrative loop of her journey close, only to open into a much larger story. She thought of the 2,000 people still looking for God in tents, and she felt a quiet gratitude for the crooked eucalyptus tree and the red dust of the West. She knew that her life in the city would never be the same. She would still work, she would still navigate the traffic and the noise, but she would do it with the heart of a girl who sits by the road. The mystery of the beggar had been solved, but the mystery of her own future was just beginning. She looked out the window as they passed the same red dust roads on the outskirts of the city, and for the first time in years, she wasn't looking at the destination. She was looking at the road itself, at the people in the shadows, and at the hidden beauty that grows only where the soil is poorest and the heart is most open. The thread of destiny was no longer a secret. It was the very fabric of her life, woven with the golden light of a western sunset and the enduring wisdom of a mother-in-law she had met in the dust. She walked away with a billion-dollar legacy just for being a fool in the dirt. But let's be real, 99% of you would have kept walking and stay broke. Is this true character, or did she just win the ultimate lottery? If you think she deserved it, comment destiny. If you think it's fake, prove me wrong in the comments. Hit that follow button or you'll miss the most shocking reveal in part 2.